The silence of the village of Eggerzalot was a thick, clotted thing, broken only by the sigh of the wind through shattered window panes and the dry rustle of dead leaves skittering across husks of human bodies. The village itself was a monument to an unimaginable horror. Houses stood as hollow-eyed skulls, their doors agape like silent screams. Inside, shadows clung to overturned furniture and the faint, sweet, sickly odor of decay and something else, something metallic and utterly spent. Every man, woman, and child, drained, emptied, consumed. The old Kovacs house, perched on the slight rise overlooking the devastation, stood a little apart, its stones seeming to weep a darker shadow than the rest. It was from here, from its cursed foundations, that the silence had first begun to spread. Like a ripple of purest, coldest dread, it all began with the damp and a man named Andras Kovacs. The first hint that the Kovacs house was more than just old stones and older memories came with the damp. Andras Kovacs, a man whose hands understood the language of wood and the stubborn silence of stone better than the babble of his village neighbors. He had been chasing a stain of mildew in the cellar for a week. It was a creeping sepia-toned map that seemed to redraw itself each night, always leading to one particular section of the ancient fieldstone foundation wall. This part of the wall, when he rapped it with the scarred knuckles of his right hand, felt hollow, like a rotted tooth. He told Alana, his wife, it was just some crumbling mortar, maybe a minor sinkhole, nothing to fret about. But Alana, whose intuition was as sharp as her embroidery needles, saw the flicker in his eyes, the one that said he was wrestling with something bigger than leaky plumbing. Their daughter, 6-year-old Sophia, a sprite with eyes the color of summer sky, just wanted to know if Papa would be done before he missed reading her a story. A few exploratory taps with a hammer turned into a more determined swing with the small sledge. The stones, centuries old, grumbled, then one gave way with a sigh of dust and a cascade of loose earth. Not into a void of more dirt, but into a set of crudely hewn steps that spiraled down into an impossible blackness. The air that breathed out was cold, carrying a scent like a freshly opened grave, mixed with something else, something metallic and expectant. This wasn't a root cellar. This was something else, something the house had been sitting on, digesting for only God knew how long. "Just checking the foundations," he called up to Alona, his voice sounding too loud in the sudden tomb-like silence that had swallowed the cellar. He didn't mention the stairs. Not yet. The flashlight beam, a nervous finger of light, probed the darkness. The passage descended tighter than a miser's fist, the stone slick with an ancient, unseen moisture. The chill wasn't just a lack of warmth. It was an active presence, seeping into his bones, making the fillings in his teeth ache. This was not a forgotten extension of his basement. This was the gullet of some primordial beast, and he was sliding down it. Bizarre occurrences began almost at once, a faint skittering, like dry claws on stone, always just around the next bend, always gone when his light stabbed at it. The unnerving sensation of being watched, not by eyes, but by something more fundamental, by the stones themselves. He'd pause, straining his ears, and hear only the frantic thud of his own heart, and a sound like distant, dry breathing. Just the drafts, he told himself. But the lie was as thin as onion skin. Shadows cast by the uneven walls seemed to writhe and stretch in the periphery of his beam, forming shapes that were almost but not quite recognizable, mocking him. He was a practical man, Andras Kovacs, but down here, practicality felt like a child's toy in a slaughterhouse. He should have turned back, God knows. He should have sealed it up, called a priest, maybe even the loony old witch doctor from the next village over, who claimed to talk to spirits. But a dark curiosity, sticky as flypaper, had him by the throat. It was his house, his land. What secrets did it hold? Days blurred into a furtive, obsessive exploration. He'd emerge covered in ancient dust and a new hunted look, fobbing Alona off with tales of stubborn tree roots and crumbling supports. She wasn't buying it. He saw the fear in her eyes, mirroring the growing dread in his own gut. Sophia started asking why Papa always smelt like dirt and secrets. Then, after what felt like kilometers of twisting, claustrophobic passages that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking, he found it. Not a hidden wine cellar or a forgotten strong room. This was a crypt. No, more than a crypt. A burial chamber. Its entrance was massive, basalt slab etched with symbols that made his skin crawl. Symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the flashlight's glow. It took him the better part of an afternoon, muscles screaming, sweat stinging his eyes, to lever it aside with the length of iron pipe he'd brought. The air that billowed out was a physical blow, a stench of unimaginable age, of rot, of something else, a faint, cloying sweetness that turned his stomach. And there, in the dead center of the chamber, on a slab of black, sweating stone, lay a casket. It was colossal, fashioned from some dark, pitted metal that seemed to drink the light, bound with bronze straps now the color of a stormy sky. Cobwebs, thick as funeral shrouds and eerily undisturbed, draped everything. Yet they couldn't entirely hide the carvings that writhed across the casket's surface, unsettling non-Euclidean geometries that made his eyes water and his head ache if he stared too long. His heart was a rampaging beast, beating itself raw against his ribs. This was it, the rotten core of the apple. With hands that shook so badly he almost dropped the flashlight, he used the iron pipe to pry at the casket's lid. It resisted. Then, with a protracted groan of tortured metal that echoed like a dying breath, it gave. The beam sliced through the gloom, and Andros stepped back, a strangled sob tearing from his throat. He almost threw up. Inside, nestled on what might have once been crimson velvet, now a mess of rotted, stained fabric, lay a thing. Humanoid, yes, but hideously elongated. The bone structure suddenly terrifyingly wrong. Its skin, where it clung to the bones, was like old, sun-baked parchment, stretched taut over knife-sharp angles. It was ancient, mummified by time and the strange dry air of the crypt, yet not entirely decayed. Patches of desiccated, leathery flesh remained, and long yellow fingernails, thick as ancient ivory, curled into talons. But the head, Lord help, the head, it was severed, laid neatly at its feet as if in some grotesque, mocking offering. The eyes were gone, leaving only hollow, shadowed sockets that seemed to stare right through him into the deepest, darkest parts of his soul. The lips, thin and black, were drawn back from a set of needle-sharp teeth, an eternal snarl etched on its dead face. It was beyond human, a relic of some forgotten, nightmarish epoch. The instant the lid was fully open, the temperature in the chamber plummeted. An unnatural, bone-aching cold filled the space, and a pressure, immense and silent, clamped down on Andros' skull. It wasn't a sound, not a movement from the occupant, but something had been unleashed. A presence, an awareness. He hadn't just found something, he'd broken something. He'd let something out. The real horror began that night. For Andros, it was the dreams, endless, suffocating chases through the shifting, lightless corridors of the maze, pursued by a faceless, formless dread that reeked of grave dirt and ancient hunger. He'd wake up clawing at the sheets, his heart trying to batter its way out of his chest. For Alona, it was worse. She dreamt of Sophia, their bright, laughing Sophia, lying pale and still in her little bed, 2 small dark bruises blooming like deadly flowers on her delicate throat. She'd wake with a silent scream, rushing to Sophia's room, only to find their daughter sleeping, for now, undisturbed. Sophia, though, started waking in the deep hours of the night, her small voice trembling as she whimpered about the shadow man in the corner of her room. A tall, cold man, she'd sob, with hands like ice. The waking world soon became undistinguishable from their nightmares. Objects moved with sly malevolence. Doors, latched and bolted, would creak open in the dead of night or slam shut with violent force in empty rooms. The cold spots Andros had first felt in the maze now migrated upstairs, pockets of unnatural, tomb-like chill that would settle in a room, making their breath plume. Puli, their shaggy, good-natured sheepdog, began to whine and cower, refusing to enter certain parts of the house, its hackles raised, its eyes fixed on some unseen horror in the middle distance. One evening, they found Puli dead in the yard, its throat torn out, but not a drop of blood on the dry earth around it, just 2 small, neat puncture marks. A creeping, greasy paranoia began to coat Andros's thoughts. He was always looking over his shoulder, catching fleeting, impossible movements from the corner of his eye. A flicker of profound darkness, too quick, too wrong to be real. Alona grew gaunt, her vibrant beauty fading, replaced by a stark, haunted look. The dark circles under her eyes were like bruises. "Andros," she'd whisper, her voice raw with fear. "What did you find down there? What did you bring into our home?" The house, their sanctuary, their legacy, passed down for many generations, had become a place of insidious, creeping terror. Driven by a desperation that tasted like ash in his mouth, Andros descended again into the maze, not to explore this time, but to find an answer. Any answer. In the burial chamber, the cold was a living thing now, a palpable entity that sought to freeze the very marrow in his bones. He noticed a loose stone in the wall beside the slab, one he'd missed in his earlier horrified haste. Behind it, in a small carved niche, lay a leather-bound journal, its pages brittle as autumn leaves, wrapped in what looked like oilskin. The script within was archaic Hungarian, spidery and faded, a testament to centuries of silence. It took him days, locked in his study, the door bolted, a bottle of Palinka, his only companion, to decipher the horrifying tale. The creature in the casket, the journal revealed, was Farcus Kovacs, an ancestor, his ancestor, a name whispered in the oldest, darkest corners of local legend. Farcus the Verfalo, the blood gobbler, a monster of insatiable appetites and inhuman cruelty from the black heart of the 15th century. The journal penned by Andros's many times great-grandfather, a man named Gaspar, chronicled Farcus's descent into something else. It spoke of his unnatural strength, his nocturnal depredations, his thirst that could not be slaked by wine or water. From here was the truly damnable part, the secret that had festered at the heart of the Kovacs family for 500 years. They hadn't killed him. Gaspar, in his spidery script, confessed a terrible truth. They had discovered through some black miracle or infernal bargain that as long as Farcus was not truly dead, as long as some grotesque spark of his unholy vitality remained, the Kovacs family prospered. Their lands yielded impossible harvests, their livestock multiplied, their enemies stumbled and fell, their coffers swelled with gold. Farcus, their monstrous progenitor, was their tethered, blood-soaked talisman. The decapitation, Gaspar wrote, his script shaking with what Andros could only imagine was terror and guilt, had been part of a complex, desperate binding ritual. The maze, a labyrinth of confusion and containment, was built to imprison him, to render him impotent, a battery of dark power that fueled their fortune. The head was severed to silence his will, the body interred to anchor his power to the land. And Andros, in his ignorant fumbling, had broken the seals. He had disturbed the binding. He had effectively cracked open Pandora's cursed box. Farcus's influence, no longer entirely contained by the ancient wards and the severed spine, began to seep beyond the crumbling walls of the Kovacs estate like a pestilent fog. Livestock in the outlying farms were found dead in their pens, not ripped apart by wolves, but drained, their bodies cold and strangely unbloodied, with only 2 small, almost surgical punctures on their necks. Then came the sickness, a wasting, insidious plague that started in the poorer outskirts of the village and crept inward. Victims grew pale, their eyes hollow, their energy leached away. They complained of terrible, vivid nightmares and a profound, unshakable chill. Old Istvan Baci, the village's unofficial historian and repository of forgotten lore. His face, a roadmap of wrinkles, muttered darkly about the Ledirk being stirred, a malevolent shape-shifting spirit that brought doom and illness, perhaps drawn or amplified by Farcus's reawakening. Others whispered of Borzakani, the old witches, finding a new terrifying strength in the growing darkness, their curses taking root with unnatural speed. The old fears, the ones that had lain dormant under generations of thin veneer, were clawing their way back into the Hungarian night. Sophia was changing. The Shadow Man visits became more frequent, more real. One night, Andros and Alona awoke to a low, guttural growling from her room. They burst in to find their daughter, their sweet Sophie, her small face contorted into a predatory snarl, her eyes glowing with a faint, hellish red light. Her tiny fingernails seemed longer, sharper, as she hissed at them. They saw her teeth, impossibly, lengthening into needle-like points. She launched herself at Andros, a tiny screeching fury, her miniature fangs aimed at his throat. He caught her, her struggle shockingly strong. The change in her was so profound it stole his breath. The little girl he knew was gone, replaced by this spawn. With Alona sobbing hysterically, Andros did the only thing he could think of to protect them both. He bound Sophia to her bed with leather straps, her small body thrashing, inhuman sounds ripping from her throat. The sight of his daughter transformed into a miniature ravening monster, gnawing at her restraints, her eyes burning with Farcus's reflected hunger, shattered something deep inside of him. Andros watched it all, the weight of his discovery, his sin, threatening to crush the air from his lungs. He saw Sophia, his little Sophia, chained like a beast, her humanity slipping away with each passing hour. He saw Alona, a ghost of her vibrant self, her eyes filled with a terror that was a mirror image of his own, a terror that was rapidly curdling into a bleak, silent accusation. Farcus, though still physically confined to the metal casket, his head still resting at his feet, was growing stronger. His presence, his will, filling the house with a suffocating blanket of ancient predatory malice. One evening, as Andros stood staring out at the darkening fields, a massive black wolf, larger than any he had ever seen, materialized at the edge of the woods bordering their property. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural crimson luminescence, and as it stared at him, a voice, dry and rustling like dead leaves, echoed not from the wolf's throat, but deep inside Andros' skull.
Sabatus fell, Andros.
It hissed, the archaic Hungarian chilling him to the core. The wolf's lipless muzzle didn't move, but the eyes held a terrifying, knowing intelligence.
Free me. Embrace your legacy, little descendant. Your blood calls to mine. The fortune of our house awaits. Your daughter, she can be whole again.
The wolf then dissolved into the deepening shadows as if it were made of smoke. The dilemma was a shard of ice pressed against his soul. Destroy Farcus, if such a thing was even possible now. If the ancient journal held any clues to such a final act, and the Kovacs family fortune, their very identity, built on 5 centuries of this monstrous, unspoken pact, would undoubtedly crumble. Their lands would wither, their luck would sour, his lineage would be cursed with ordinariness, perhaps even poverty and grinding misfortune. The bitter price for severing their ties to the source of their unnatural, blood-soaked history. Gaspar and the ancestors who followed had not dared to truly kill Farcus, fearing this very devastation. Or he could unleash him fully. The thought was a viper in his brain, monstrous, a betrayal of every decent instinct he possessed. But then he would look at Sophia, strapped to her bed, her small body convulsing, a grotesque parody of childhood. He would hear her weak, animalistic cries. He would think of Alona, her sanity fraying like an old rope, her eyes begging him to do something. He would hear the church bells from the village tolling for another victim of the wasting sickness, and the whispers of plague and panic in the village square. One night, a leathery bat, impossibly large, clung to his bedroom window, its tiny black eyes glinting with an unnatural sheen. As Andros stared, frozen, a thin, reedy voice, like the scratching of bone on slate, whispered from the creature, yet also inside his mind.
The girl suffers, Andros. She is becoming becoming like us. Free the master, and her suffering ends. She will be your Sophia again. Whole, pure, a gift for a gift. His word, our word.
The whispers from the crypt, from the wolf, from the bat grew more insistent, more seductive. Farcus, or whatever intelligence resided in those ancient remains, showed him visions. The Kovacs family, restored to an even greater, unimaginable glory, their influence spreading like a shadow across the land, their wealth a glittering mountain. Sophia, rosy-cheeked and laughing again, free from her chains. Alona, her beauty restored, her eyes clear. All it would take, the whispers promised, was one final act of acceptance. The binding was already fractured. The prison merely needed to be unmade. The gate simply needed to be thrown wide. In the end, the decision was made, not in a moment of clear thought, but in a fog of despair and sleepless exhaustion and a desperate, selfish love for the daughter he was losing. It was made in the dead of a moonless, storm-racked night, with the wind howling around the eaves of the old stone house like the tormented cries of the damned, and Sophia's pained whimpers echoing from her room. Andras Kovacs, his face a pale, sweat-slicked mask of grim, terrible resolve, descended one last time into the stinking, cold heart of the maze, into the burial chamber of his monstrous ancestor. The air within was thick, almost vicious, with a palpable, ancient power. The severed head of Farcus, resting at the feet of the desiccated corpse, seemed to watch him from its hollow sockets, an unseen triumphant light burning within their depths. The journal, Gaspar's desperate, terrified confession, had hinted at the final unthinkable rite. It wasn't about destruction. It was about reunion, about acceptance, about a merging of blood and will. With a thick cry that was more animal than human, a sound torn from the deepest, most primal part of his being, Andras lifted the severed head of Farcus Kovacs. It was surprisingly heavy, the bone cold as winter river stones, the desiccated flesh like ancient leather. He knelt by the casket, by the waiting, horrific, expectant body of his ancestor. The whispers in his mind were ecstatic now, a chorus of silent, screaming triumph. He didn't just place the head back on the jagged, severed stump of the neck. The ritual, the true and final unleashing, required more. It required a blood offering, a dark communion, a willing acceptance of the monstrous lineage that flowed, black and corrupted, through his own veins. His hand, holding his hunting knife, was surprisingly steady. He drew the blade across his own left wrist, a shallow cut, but deep enough. Blood, dark and shockingly warm, welled up. Then, with a prayer that was a blasphemy, he pressed his bleeding wrist against the needle-sharp, protruding teeth of the severed head. For a moment, nothing. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable. Then a faint tremor ran through the severed head. The parchment-like eyelids, caked with the dust of ages, began to flutter, slowly, agonizingly. They peeled open. The eyes beneath were not the dull, milky orbs of the dead. They were a predatory, luminous red, like embers fanned in a dying fire, and they fixed on Andras with an intelligence that was ancient, malevolent, and utterly, terrifyingly aware. A low sound, like air escaping a long-sealed crypt, rasped from the creature's throat. The head, impossibly tilted, its dead weight shifting. The fang, stained with a dirty yellow, grazed his skin, sending a jolt of icy fire up his arm. Then, with a sudden, shocking strength, the jaws clamped down. Not a savage tearing bite, but a precise, almost surgical pressure on those needle teeth, sharper than any razor, pierced his flesh. Andras cried out, a strangled gasp of pain and terror. He tried to pull his hand away, but the creature's grip was like iron. He could feel the hot, rhythmic pull of his blood. His life force was drawn into that dead mouth. The red eyes burned into his, and in their depths, he saw not just hunger, but a dawning, triumphant glee. It was the look of a predator that had, against all odds, tasted life again. He could feel a coldness spreading from his wrist, a creeping numbness that was more terrifying than the pain. The creature's lips, dry and cracked, seemed to grow fuller, a faint, ghastly flush spreading across the sallow cheeks of the severed head. It was drinking, and as it drank, a spark of unholy vitality ignited within it, a grotesque parody of life returning to the dead. The eyes, if possible, grew brighter, more focused, and a low, contented sigh, like the hiss of a serpent, vibrated against his skin. As the last of his strength ebbed, as the world began to gray out at the edges of his vision, Farcus's head, now plump and almost vibrant with stolen life, detached its fangs from Andros's shriveled wrist. Andros collapsed to the stone floor, a discarded husk. Slowly, Farcus Kovacs, the Verfalo, stood up. He was no longer merely a desiccated corpse. He was tall, gaunt, but imbued with a terrifying power. His skin pale but smooth, his eyes burning like bell fire. He flexed his long talon-tipped fingers, then looked down at the shriveling form of Andros, a faint, cruel smile playing on his lips. He bent, and with a sound like a starving wolf tearing into its kill, he sank his fangs into Andros's throat. He drank deeply, leisurely, his body seeming to swell with power. Andros's form shrinking, withering, until only a dry, paper-thin corpse remained on the crypt floor, eyes wide with a final, unutterable horror. Farcus stood, wiping a trickle of blood from his chin with the back of a pale hand. He looked complete, ancient, eternal. A small, hesitant footstep echoed from the passage. Sophia, no longer bound, no longer snarling, stood at the entrance of the chamber. Her eyes were her own again, the clear blue of a summer sky, though now shadowed with an unnatural, ageless wisdom. The red glow was gone, her teeth normal. She looked at Farcus, not with fear, but with a calm, quiet recognition. Farcus extended a long, elegant hand.
"Come, child,"
he said, his voice no longer a dry rasp, but a rich, cultured baritone that held the chill of the grave. Sophia silently took his hand. He led her out of the crypt, out of the maze, leaving the shriveled husk of her father behind. As they stepped into the crumbling cellar of the Kovacs' house, Farcus looked ahead to the village, a predatory gleam in his crimson eyes.
"Now, little one,"
he purred, his grip tightening slightly on Sophia's small hand.
"let's go have lunch."